Perfect. Well, as Chip mentioned, I'm Kara, and Jess will be joining us for just a little bit, but we're going to be talking to you today about the status of on-demand gear in the U.S. South Atlantic black sea bass pot portion of the fishery. Just to orient you to what we're going to be talking about, so we're hoping to give you a little bit of background you might need on this, a little bit about the right whale status, the Atlantic large whale take reduction team and plan, and some recent history there, a bit about on-demand gear, which is also called ropeless, and then we'll go specifically into the Southeast black sea bass fishery, the current closures, EFPs that are currently being, where gear is currently being tested, the benefits of on-demand gear, and then some wrap up and next steps. And so some of this information may be a refresher for you, some of it might be new. We ask that you hold questions until the end, but if it's helpful, there should be slide numbers. You can jot down the slide number, and when you ask a question, we can reference back a specific slide. So right whales have been, their population has been in decline since the early 2010s. There was a big ecosystem regime shift, which shifted the distribution of right whales. The number of deaths and serious injuries increased significantly, and it has been outpacing births, leading to a decline. On the next slide, there we go. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about both of those factors. So there is an ongoing UME, the website's at the bottom of this screen. It's an unusual mortality event that was declared in 2017. Since then, there's been 115 documented dead, serious injuries, which are injuries that are more likely to result in mortality, and then sublethal injuries and illnesses. So the number of mortalities and serious injuries is 70. We know that we're detecting only about a third of the deaths. And the number, so that's all on the left-hand side of the screen. And then there's been 45 to date sublethal injuries or illnesses. And so these are things that we think are impacting the reproductive health of the population as well. So all of those factors, all of those counts are exceeding the amount of calves that are born annually. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the annual calf count of known calves over the years, and the last 5 years have been low compared to other years. And additionally, some of the calves being born in recent years are also the ones that we're seeing as dead or serious injuries. So in the UME, those 115 cases in the UME, between 50 and 75% per year are entanglement related. So this isn't entanglements in a specific fishery. There's not always gear on an animal where that fishery can be traced back, but in any given year, 50 to over 75% are entanglements. On the left-hand side of the screen is just an example of how a whale may get entangled in that vertical line from the buoy to the trap. But again, like I said, not all entanglements we have known gear for. So because the incidental mortality and serious injury of commercial fisheries exceeds the potential biological removal, which is an MMPA metric, very different from any fisheries metrics you might be familiar with, we can convene a take reduction team, which can help develop recommendations to reduce entanglement-related mortality and serious injury. So the Atlantic large whale take reduction team was convened many, many years ago, but in recent history, they've been meeting regularly to discuss fisheries on the US East Coast. And I'll go into a little bit of the history, but predominantly lobster and Jonah crab in the Northeast, and then the remainder of the gillnet and trap pot fisheries coastwide. The take reduction team is a multi-stakeholder team that develops recommendations by consensus and provides them to NMFS, which is ultimately responsible for taking action. So in recent years, excuse me, starting in 2018 and 2019, the team met to discuss recommendations to reduce entanglements, specifically in lobster and Jonah crab fisheries. Final action on that rule was taken in 2021. And this is important because it included closures, both new closures and modifying old closures, to be closed to vertical buoy lines, which meant that fishing would be allowed with on-demand gear, given they met any other criteria needed under the councils, in addition to implementing weak rope and increased gear marking on the remaining lines. The Atlantic large whale take reduction team then started meeting in 2021 and 2022 to discuss recommendations for reducing risk from entanglements in the remaining fisheries coastwide. So all the gillnet fisheries and trap pot fisheries, which includes the Southeast Black Sea Bass fishery. Risk in the Southeast fisheries was low given the amount of work that had already been done, but there was still things that could be done to proactively protect right whales and to continue to protect right whales in the Southeast. Final deliberations included coastwide recommendations as well as regionally specific recommendations, one of which was to bring the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council closures into the plan, but as a closure to vertical buoy lines, which means that these areas that had been historically closed in the winter season would be allowed to be fished in through the use of on-demand gear. Again, that given that other Fishery Management Council regulations and needs were met. NMFS anticipates having a proposed rule published in 2024 that's informed by recent TRT deliberations, which will include the Southeast fisheries and Southeast Black Sea Bass, and anticipates taking final action in 2025. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jess to tell you a little bit about on-demand fishing.
Great, thank you so much, Kara. So I'm gonna transition us a bit into on-demand fishing, and so I'm gonna talk about a little bit about on-demand fishing, just kind of give some general background, and then we'll move into the specifics related to the South Atlantic Black Sea Bass fishery. So as Kara mentioned, the large whale team is moving towards closures to traditional trap pot rope and buoy lines, but will open those areas to the use of on-demand gears. So I know, just to back up a little bit, there are some terminology, differences. It's often called on-demand gear. It's also been called ropeless gear, but in general, it means the same thing. These systems are using far less rope in the water than traditional gear designs. And to locate and haul the gear, traditional methods would tether the gear to a rope attached to the buoy at the water's surface. So the main characteristic of on-demand gear or ropeless gear is that there is no need for this gear to buoy tether. So there's a variety of different on-demand gears currently available, and a number of studies in multiple fisheries across the United States testing these gears. So the fisheries methods, locations, and operational protocols really dictate what is the best gear for each fishery. So on-demand gear is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all for all fisheries and on different coasts or in different areas. There are kind of three major gears being trialed up and down the East Coast, and a majority of those are based on acoustic retrieval systems, as kind of shown here in this graphic. Acoustic systems are when fishermen on the vessel approach a location in which the gear was originally set, and they send an acoustic signal to the gear to initiate the release of a mechanism that can therefore allow them to retrieve that gear in some way. And so these are the three major types of gear here listed on the bottom. So there's the pop-up buoys that once signaled the buoy's release and can be retrieved like traditional gear. So the line is attached to the buoys float to the surface, and then the fishermen can retrieve them as in a more traditional fashion. There's also the inflatable lift bag system. When the acoustic signal is received by this system, that lift bag that you see there inflates, and the whole system floats to the surface. So there's less line associated with this system, and essentially that bag is just pulling the gear directly to the surface. There's also the buoyant spool system. And again, this is similar to the pop-up buoy, and that when the spool is triggered, it floats to the surface, unwinding the line, and then it can be retrieved again in that semi-traditional manner of pulling the gear onto the vessel. So the South Atlantic black sea bass fishery is pretty unique in that it is somewhat attended fishery. And so gear is set for a short amount of time before retrieval. So that gives this fishery a little bit more flexibility with different types of on-demand gear. Also, the black sea bass fishery tends not to overlap with a lot of trawl gear, which tends to be a problem in many other areas along the coast. So acoustic systems may not be as necessary for the black sea bass fishery, which again gives them even more flexibility. So given these unique features, the use of timers have shown a lot of success and a lot of support in this fishery. And timers, what they do is they attach to the pop-up buoy system, and instead of being released by an acoustic signal, the timer will trigger the buoy release after a set duration of time. And so timers can be really useful is because they are less expensive than an acoustic system. And so they make sense for smaller fisheries that are especially working with fewer pots than maybe larger fisheries, such as the lobster fishery up north of us. Next slide, please, Kara. Great. So this is a little video here. I'll try to walk you through. Oh, Kara's put the captions on for me, which is great. Thank you, Kara. And so this is just so that you're able to visualize those different types of gear that sit on the bottom and what some forms of them look like when they're sitting on the bottom. And so the fisherman in the video, the little cartoon fisherman, is sending an acoustic signal to the gear, and you can see that it lifts the gear to the surface, and then it can be retrieved by the fisherman. Retrieving the gear. So this is the timed release method, and you can see that the fisherman is able to set that timer for the amount of time that works best for them. So there is some line in the water there, so there is some risk of entanglement, but again, much reduced because it's not setting for an extended duration of time like traditional gear. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how these systems generally work. Next slide, Kara. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. So now we're going to transition into talking about the South Atlantic black sea bass trap pot fishery specifically. So next slide, please. Great. So I wanted to start off just to make sure that we were all on the same page as a reminder, to give some reminders of what the current regulatory landscape is in the Southeast under the Snapper Grouper FMP and Regulatory Amendment 16. So I'm sure many of you are familiar that there are 2 seasonal closures in the Southeast for the South Atlantic black sea bass trap pot fishery. There is a smaller closure, and that is highlighted here in the yellow, and that's on the front and tail end of the North Atlantic right whale migration season. And then there's that extended closure, which is essentially that yellow plus that blue seen in this graphic here. And that goes into effect in December and lifts at the end of March. And that is when more whales are moving in and out of the southeastern United States. And this larger closure is intended to provide greater protective measures during the height of the calving season for these whales, particularly when there's a lot of reproductive females and calves in the area. Next slide, please, Kara. So as a means to look for some more economical fishing solutions given these closed areas, researcher Kim Strawicki and her team and Georgia Sea Grant and commercial black sea bass fishermen began experimenting with on-demand gear technology for the black sea bass fishery. This initially began in August 2020 when the first EFP or exempted fishing permit was authorized for on-demand black sea bass gear in the Southeast. The initial EFP here issued in 2020 was prohibited still in the closed areas. The idea here was particularly for sensitive protected areas for these very endangered whales that test the gear outside of the area make sure that it was effective and the success rates were high before it was tested inside those sensitive closed areas. And this initial EFP included one fisherman off the coast of Georgia to assist with these trials. So moving forward in October 2020, there was an amendment made to that initial EFP, which added some additional fishermen into the trial from North Carolina. So as you can see, it really started to grow legs quickly, which is very exciting, and fishermen were really working well with the research team to test these gears. So in February 2022, a second EFP was authorized. This was again issued to the research collaboration with Kim Schwicke and Georgia Sea Grant, but this time the area extended to inside the closures, given the success under the initial EFP. The gear was effective, it was being retrieved at an extremely high rate, and so us on the protected resources side felt comfortable and allowing the testing to occur now in the closed areas. And we were really happy to see at this point the research team had engaged fishermen from all up and down the southeast coast, and so there was fishermen from the coast, working off the coast of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida that were all set to participate in this trial. So that was really phenomenal to see. And in August 22, that I believe that EFP was amended again, so that even more fishermen could participate in that trial. And currently that EFP is set to expire in 2025. So I think overall, the story that we're trying to show here, and maybe you can see by this timeline, is that black sea bass fishermen have been extremely proactive and engaged to help find solutions to maximize fishing opportunities while reducing risk to large whales. That has been really, really positive for this fishery. Next slide, please, Kara. All right, so what are the benefits to on-demand fishing for the black sea bass fishery? So given that on-demand gear in those initial trials was shown to be so effective and there was really excellent retrieval rates, this has allowed fishermen to have access to closures because of that reduced risk to right whale, because there's not that persistent buoy line in the water. If there is a line, it's only in the water column for a very short amount of time before that gear is retrieved. So these closures, as you saw, these closures, the closures are closer to shore. And so it saves the fishermen time and fuel resources to be able to access those closures. And so they can essentially fish more efficiently. So there's a lot of savings to fishing in those closed areas with these gear types. And with that ability to fish closer to shore too, there's also some reduction in safety risks, having to go much farther offshore, and oftentimes the winter, which is the preferred season, and weather can be more unpredictable and risky. And next slide, Kara. Great, thank you. And so for large whales, particularly right whales, the benefits from on-demand fishing are just quite honestly very straightforward. There's no vertical line in the water for a prolonged period, so it leads to minimal, or in some cases where there's no line used for the system, like for lift bags, there's no entanglement risk to the animal. So that's a real positive for right whales. And as Kara said, entanglements are a leading cause of serious injury and mortality for these animals. So reducing that risk is optimal. Next slide, Kara. Great. So we have been thrilled here in Protected Resources watching the progress of the EFPs and the fish and the continuation of more and more fishermen wanting to engage in these trials with Kim Schwicke and the Georgia Sea Grant team. Rarely is there such an obvious win-win situation for a fishery and endangered species. So this has been a really exciting prospect to watch the on-demand gear develop for this particular fishery. And as I said, this is a really unique fishery. And so they have some more unique tools at their disposal, such as timers, and they don't have to necessarily worry about the gear conflicts with trawlers. So pending future actions, black sea bass I think is in the best position, quite honestly, in the nation to move forward with codified on-demand gear. And they could potentially serve as a model for the nation and for other fisheries. In terms of next steps and what's happening with this fishery, my understanding is that Georgia Sea Grant is going to be hosting a South Atlantic ropeless gear workshop here in a few weeks to review and assess the application of on-demand gear and share knowledge between managers and fishermen and make recommendations and priorities. Again, just continuing building those relationships and bringing on-demand gear to the forefront. So we, particularly at Protected Resources here at NMFS, are truly committed to working with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council and the Black Sea Bass Fishery and our researchers and all our constituents on this issue as we help shepherd on-demand gear into the future. And I think, Kara, if you can go to the next slide, that is all for us. And we are happy to take questions on right whales, on so far the process, the regulatory process that on-demand gear has taken for the South Atlantic fishery. I think we might even have Kim Schwicke on the line who could potentially answer more specific questions about the trials, if there were any more pointed questions regarding what's being done in the Southeast.
Okay, given that, I will take back over and just go over a brief discussion on how to operate the webinar again. Hold on one second. All right, once again, to operate the webinar, there's 3 different ways to do this. You can type into the question box here, highlighted in green, any questions, and I'll read those aloud to the presenters as well as to the rest of the group. And we hope to have an open conversation about what we're talking about here today. If you'd like to raise your hand, just click on this icon that is a hand-drawn hand. And if it's green, that means your hand is not raised. If it's red, that means it is raised. And once we notify you to speak, or once we click on you to speak, the system will notify you that you've been unmuted. Then you'll need to unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone. Once it turns green, you should be able to speak. So with that, go ahead and raise your hand. I've got a few questions in the question box. Let's see. The first question was, how many fishermen are even participating in the black sea bass fishery? It's a very different fishery than the Northeast. So
yeah, I'm happy to. Oh, go ahead, Chip. Sorry, didn't mean to jump in.
Go ahead, Jessica.
No, I was going to say, I think my understanding is from the latest count, and perhaps someone from the council could just check me, but I believe there are about 35 fishermen or 35 permits at least in the black sea bass fishery in the Southeast. And I believe there are, from the last report we had, there are 14 or at least 14 fishermen participating in the trials. And at this point, I'm not sure if there may be more at this point.
Okay, and then the next statement was, it cannot serve as a model for the nation because it's a low density fishery. It can serve as a model for low density fisheries.
Well, I think my comment there was, I appreciate that. And I hear you, I recognize that. I think my comment was in terms of the process for this, it can serve as a model in terms of how the EFPs, I think, were issued and how the progress and the research progressed in terms of how the EFPs started small. They started outside the closures, so there was minimal risk, checking for effectiveness, moving towards inside the closures, and then gradually growing the number of fishermen. I really do think that the way the research and the management process has worked here and dovetailed could really serve for a model for other parts of the country that haven't yet explored some of, on-demand gears for their fishery. As I said, from the beginning, there's no one size fits all for the nation. All fisheries have differences, but in terms of the management and the research dovetailing here really nicely, I think it can potentially really help out some other fisheries in terms of how to move forward.
Thank you for that response. There was a question typed in by Kathy Knowlton. Near the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned knowing a right whale data component was underestimated by 1/3 or 2/3. Perhaps it was whale mortalities. Would you speak more about that? So
yeah, so there are estimates of total mortality per year in the fishery, in the whale population. And what we see as dead bodies on the beach is about 1/3 of the total mortalities in the population. So does that answer the question, Chip?
I think so.
Okay.
Kathy, I can unmute you if you want me to. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I see what you're saying now. So you see effects of 2/3 more mortalities, but in terms of having the samples wash up, the bodies wash up, that's 1/3 of them. Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you, that's a great question.
Any other hands? What types of gear retrieval failures were encountered?
So based on the report that we have from Kim's work, and if Kim is on the line and she wants to take that, I'm happy to pass this to her because I don't necessarily know the fine specifics of each. But my understanding, based on the information that has been shared with us, is that I believe gear retrieval has been between 95% and 99%, and then the issues that they did encounter were based on human error, so not necessarily problems with the gear. But if Kim's on, she might be able to speak more to the specifics on that.
Kim is not on, but Bradford's on. He might be able to answer some of the questions. Brad, you're self-muted if you wanted to speak.
I don't have this specific retrieval rate, but Jessica is very correct in that the problems have all been human error as far as how the gear is set up when it's deployed. Something has been wrong, and that has made it unable to be retrieved. They had some interactions with some other fish species that gave them some problems as well. That's about all I have, sorry. And Kim's not available at the moment, so.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Yep.
I am not seeing any other hands raised right now, so I'm going to ask a question. Do you know the cost differences between these different types of retrieval systems or anything like that? I mean, they look very different, and it seems like price would range quite a bit.
Yes, yeah, they do. I mean, I can tell you generally that the acoustic system still price is quite high, right? Because they're still experimental and they're not made for a large market yet. So my understanding is some of those systems can range within the thousands of dollars, and so that makes it really challenging for very small fisheries that potentially aren't working with some of the really high dollar values that some of the fisheries in the Northeast, like snow crab and and lobster are working with. But the timers themselves, my understanding, are less than $100. I've heard that depending on the timer they get, they can be anywhere from about, you know, $10 to $80. So those at this moment, my understanding is many of the fishermen are favoring those. But I do believe there are some Black Sea bass fishermen that are considering, that prefer the acoustic systems and are considering investing in those. I think, Chip, the hope is that as these systems become more widely used and more widely available, that will push costs down. And so hopefully that will continue to make progress on reducing costs for some of those acoustic systems.
Thank you. Brad, I see you have your hand raised.
I just wanted to say that as far as the black sea bass fishery is concerned, the most popular acoustic system that they're using is about $350 a unit, just for reference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Steve Turner has a question. Did each trap have a lift device, or would one lift device work for a string? I know in the South Atlantic, you're not allowed to have trawls for the black sea bass pot fishery. It's one lift or one string per pot. So could you talk about that a bit?
Yes, and correct me if I'm not understanding the question, but I believe the question is, could you, if there were multiple pots on a string, could you use one lift system? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and so yes, the answer is yes, you could, because in the lobster fishery, they do use trawls. And so they've been trialing a number of these acoustic systems and are, you know, lift bags, spools and buoys, and they attach it to the first pot, similar to like you would do with a traditional set. And then once they get the first trap, then they can pull up the rest. Now, I know Kim for the black sea bass fishery and her group, they've been trialing all different types of systems with the black sea bass fishery, just to make sure that they can kind of check the box on each of them and see what the issues are with each, to document that, and what is most preferred, even depending on, you know, slight variances between areas in the Southeast.
They've also been trialing what they are calling 2-bys and 4-bys, which is instead of a lift bag on a single pot, they are essentially strapping together 2 pots in a 2-by or 4 pots in a 4-by. So this fishery is limited to 32 pots. And so, no, 35 pots, excuse me, there are 32 fishermen. And so they can reduce the number of systems they need if in fact the 2-bys and the 4-bys are working for them on the fishery side of things.
Thank you for that. Myra has her hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Chip. Thanks, Jessica and Cara. I just curious, I signed on a little bit late, so maybe I missed it, but I'm wondering if NIMS is going to require some sort of approval process for the retrieval systems. Is it going to be one of those situations where the agency has to issue vendor specifications so that these systems can be manufactured and available at different costs, or how is that going to work?
Well, so I think in terms of Myra, so I think, are you specifically asking in terms of enforcement, or are you asking in terms of reporting gear lost, or, sorry, I'm not quite sure.
I was thinking
clarify your question.
Yeah, I was thinking along the lines of, you know, like, for example, NIMS has a list of approved, for example, vessel monitoring system that are, you know, there's just a small pool that fishermen can choose from. Is that going to be sort of the same situation here?
Yeah, I'm not sure. This is all still developing out. In the Northeast is taking a little bit of a different road than us because of similar to what you said, they're thinking about standardization of gear. Given that the black sea bass fishery is currently the only fishery exploring on-demand gear in our region, we haven't gone that far yet. And given the trials are still continuing, we haven't thought about standardization at this point yet. But I can tell you that the Northeast is thinking about it in terms of would that be a fruitful road to go down, or is the technology still new that they need to wait a bit and let some of these technologies develop a bit more?
And if I could just add one thing. So right now, both under council regs and the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team regs, the pots have to come back at the end of a trip. They can't leave the pots out in the EEZ overnight. And so that's sort of what we mean by attended fishery. Those fishermen are going out with their gear, they're staying with their gear during the day, and they're coming back. So timers, the timed gear is an option because they are not leaving that gear out for the ropes to pop up in an area where there's currently no ropes. And so there are some considerations based on the gear type within the fishery.
I know one of the issues in the South Atlantic region has typically been the current speed that can lead to some issues. So it's encouraging to hear that the currents aren't causing an issue with retrieval. If you're getting 99 to 90 or 95 to 99% retrieval, and it's been documented as human error, I'm curious, were you guys surprised to see that finding, given the currents in the areas?
No, I wasn't as much because this gear has been successful in parts of the Northeast where the currents are also quite powerful. Now, what they, I will say just anecdotally, Kim has shared with me that the fishermen aren't very fond of the lift bags they've been trialing because those are more sensitive to some of the currents and become a bit more challenging to retrieve because whereas you're bringing the entire pot up with the bag, whereas with like the pop-up buoys using a timer, you still have the gear on the bottom and just the buoy is being released tethered to a line. So in some, and I can't speak to the exact areas within the Southeast that prefer using the pop-up buoys, but I know there has been some challenges using lift bags in some areas.
And then just tangential piece of information related to your question. There's anecdotal evidence in the Northeast that has a high rate of gear loss, that having these ropeless systems have allowed them to get gear back that they otherwise would not have been able to get back as well. So that's a nice benefit that we hadn't previously mentioned.
Thank you. Any other questions? Not seeing any other hands, so I'll ask another one. You know, management quite often can take some time to get regulations in place. Is it possible to extend the current EFP longer, or will this is the last opportunity for that EFP to continue?
Yeah, Chip, that's a great question. I think that's going to depend a lot on the council's will. But I would think at this point, given that regulations do take some time, one of the reasons that we are trying to highlight this gear and highlight these processes is to start thinking about, is this something that the council may consider wanting to move forward with, is to potentially think about allowing these gear types outside of an EFP, or do they want to see extended trials there are some fishermen that we have spoken to that are ready to go. They want to purchase some on-demand gear and have the ability to use it. So whether that's going to move forward under an EFP or regulations, I think remains to be seen, but we are committed to continue to present information to the council and work with you on making those decisions, because we do think that this, again, is really a win-win situation for a highly endangered whale in the fishery, and we don't tend to get those often. So we're really excited about the prospect of this moving forward in whichever manner it does.
Thanks for the response. Any other questions? We'll give it just another 10 or 15 seconds to see if anybody pops up.
And we mean it when on the screen with our emails. If you have questions after this or you'd like to get into contact with us, please shoot us an email.
All right, I'm not seeing any others, so thank you so much for a great presentation today. It was good to hear about this. I think it's exciting that the fishermen may be able to use a gear that gets them access to some historic fishing grounds. So it'll be very interesting. This webinar will be, hopefully we're going to have it posted by Friday. So if anybody missed it or you want to send it to some of your colleagues or some of the fishermen that might be interested in using this gear, it will be available on our webpage at the seminar series, just where you registered for it. We're not going to have a seminar series next month since it's our council meeting, but the following month, we are going to have a presentation on the rock shrimp fishery. It's going to be given by Laura Lee Thompson, whose family helped start the rock shrimp fishery. It's mainly going to be describing the history of it. So with that, thank you guys for a wonderful presentation today and everybody for attending, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.